You are who you are today because of what has gone into your mind. You change who you are today by changing what goes into your mind. On a cool fall evening in 1970, I was sitting on the living room floor with about 70 to 80 other young people, listening to a man from one of the local churches bringing us teaching to our commune. He began by reading the first two verses of Romans chapter 12, and I was mesmerized. I have no idea what he said after that. I was lost. That's probably happened to you sometimes. The Lord gets a hold of you on something that I say, and you're gone. The Lord's teaching you, and you don't even remember what I say. But those two verses became my life verse, and they've guided me ever since in everything I do. Those verses are, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Just as a side note, that phrase spiritual worship is the Greek word latruo, from which we get our word latrine. It's the very low, it's the low, it's the small, it's common. We just worship the Lord by our being. Anyway, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, it was probably that night when I dedicated myself to truly serving the Lord completely. That's all I wanted to do. Over the years, those two verses have guided me, as I said, in everything. Now, from these verses, I see four things we can do at any time and should do all the time. The first thing is that we should present ourselves. We give ourselves to the Lord. We did that in a couple of songs today. We just dedicate our lives to the Lord. Now, the second thing you do is to not be conformed. Non-conformity. And we'll talk about that. Thirdly is the transformation, to be transformed. And then finally, testing. The testing is not testing you, but it is you testing God, and we'll get to that. Growing up Catholic, it seemed that the only way to truly serve God as a man was to become a priest, or as a woman to become a nun. These were referred to as vocation, which means a calling. Now, leaving the Catholic world and joining the evangelical world, the only way to truly serve God was to surrender to the ministry. This concept is limiting at best and condemning at worst. It relegates the majority of people to a place of not being very useful in God's eyes. Thankfully, though, most of us know better than that now. We know that we are able to serve God in whatever place we find ourselves. Paul indicates this truth later on in this same chapter, where he says, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. Let's use the gifts we've been given. We are all given different gifts, and we are to use them to the best of our ability in living our life for the Lord. And there is no single gift that is more important than another. We tend to elevate them, but the most important gift is the one that's needed at the moment. If I'm stuck on the side of the highway with a flat tire, I don't need you to come up to me speaking in tongues or prophesying. I need somebody with the gift of helps to come and help me change that tire. The most important gift is the one that is necessary in a moment. In a little while, we're going to be enjoying the gifts of those who can cook. And we'll all enjoy that gift. My gift of teaching is basically useless when it comes to planning a meal. It doesn't serve any purpose there. Our individual giftings do not in any way make us more important than another, except maybe in the moment it is needed and used to serve. So whatever gift you have, if it's needed in the moment and you use it to serve others, to serve the Lord, that's the most important gift. Now that's step number one. For me, I found what I was supposed to do from reading in the book of Ezra, chapter 7 and verse 10. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. Now, this first part is what each of us must do as we live this life. We must set our heart to pursue something. Now, most of us, as we reach retirement age, we tend to leave that off. But what's it like to never have a goal for the day or something to reach for or whatever? No, we always have something, and we set our hearts. And then there is learning and training associated with anything we may choose to do. Even at our age past retirement, there are still things we can learn. Now, young people often ask about how they can know God's will for their life, what they should do, whom they should marry, that kind of thing. And applying the principles given in this verse is the best way I know of discovering God's will. What I mean is the verse in Romans 12, not this one, but it begins here to set your heart. The first step, number one, is to give yourself to the Lord. Lord, I want what you want. I want to do what you want me to do. Now, how that is done may very well be different for each person, but it is something that must occur at some point, that dedication. Secondly, is the principle of nonconformity. Nonconformity to the world. He says, be not conformed to this world. Now, that's a tough one for most of us because all we've ever known is to go along with the crowd. That's what we do. Whatever someone else wants is good enough. I was substituting at the end of the year for a class of seniors, and instead of teaching, I asked them about their future. One girl said she wanted to be an anesthesiologist. I pursued her with questions to get her to think about her decision and to enlighten the rest of us. She wanted to do that because her mother was an anesthesiologist and because they make a lot of money. Now, back then when I did that, she said it was about $160,000 a year. However, as we talked, she expressed disappointment that her mother was never available for her or her school activities. She was just going along with what had been presented to her, and then she realized by the time we finished our conversation, she never really wanted to be an anesthesiologist. I wasn't able to keep track of this young lady and find out what she did, but that might have been a pivotal moment for her in that one class under a substitute whom she never saw again. But she was being conformed to the world around her. Each of us has the potential to be conformed by our environment, but there's no requirement that that be the case. Our environment, our upbringing, those we hang with, what we listen to, what we watch, all have influence on our life. Any one of those factors, or all of them combined, have the power to conform us to that existence. However, like I said, there's no law that says it has to be that way. We all know there's simply too many stories of people who have overcome their disadvantages, gotten out of their bad environment, and made something useful of their life. I could give you story after story after story of celebrities, actors, singers, sports people who have overcome extreme disadvantages, to rise to the elite of their field. So the second step to knowing God's will is to refuse to be conformed to the world around you. Of course, if we stop there, then you're just a rebel. And being just a rebel can get you in trouble. It's the third step that enables us to make that refusal, and that is transforming. Being transformed. In order to avoid being conformed, we must be transformed. I've always loved those two words used together like that, because conformed means formed with or by. Transformed means formed across. Absolutely cross-grained to everything else. When you are conformed, you are forced into a mold. When you are transformed, you are free to fill whichever mold you choose. How many children are at the effect of their parents deciding what they need to be? The boy loves playing the piano, but the father won't let him practice because he puts a gun in his hands and wants him to become a hunter. Things like that. Happens all the time. Both being conformed and being transformed is something which happens to you. It is not something that you do. It just happens. You will either be conformed or you will be transformed. Being conformed is to take the path of least resistance, which is the normal human tendency. Mama says I should be a nurse. I guess I'll be a nurse. But being transformed requires the effort on your part of renewing your mind. Renewing is something that is done continually, and it is something that you must avail yourself of. You are who you are and where you are today because of what has gone into your mind. You change who you are and where you are today by changing what goes into your mind. When we feed our minds on the same stuff every day that infects us in a certain direction, especially the news and views from others, we become conformed. While I was living in Northern California, this became very clear to me. Most everyone in that small liberal town listened to and agreed with Jim Hightower, who was the opposite of Rush Limbaugh. Out there, Rush Limbaugh was ridiculed and despised, but I could find few who had ever listened to his radio program. When I moved back to the Midwest, I could hardly find anyone who had ever heard of Jim Hightower, because the public broadcast radio stations are essentially banned from the dial of most people in the Midwest. They're too liberal. This kind of closed-minded listening is a major detriment to growth and understanding and change. If we want our world to change, we need to understand why the world is the way it is. We can't have just simple answers like Biden's a goof. Can't do that. That's not an answer to bringing about change. How can we possibly bring change to the world around us if we do not understand why it is a certain way? How can we bring change to our own inner world if we are not willing to confront the reasons why we are the way we are? I believe it was the philosopher Socrates who said the unexamined life is not worth living. We must occasionally examine our beliefs in the light of new knowledge to see if what we believe is still true. It was Corrie ten Boom who quipped, "Sometimes I take my brains out and jump up and down on them to prevent hardening of the categories." This is true for anything, not just our religious thinking. There isn't a category of your life which should not be examined regularly. When we are able to move into this realm of constantly allowing our minds to remain flexible, we will then be able to know God's will for our life. We know it by applying the fourth principle in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, which says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." When you have made the first three principles a part of your life, you are then ready to test the waters, as it were, to discover God's will. You will know it's God's will because it is good, acceptable, and perfect. Now, contrary to some popular teachings, this is not describing three different wills of God or three levels of His will. God has a design for us which is good, acceptable, and perfect. And testing is how you get to discover God's will. You begin down the path that appears to be correct for you. If it is not right, you can rest assured that the Holy Spirit will make that plain to you. Let me give you the steps that I use in decision making. From Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, it says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." There's a lot of power in that principle right there. "And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." We want to be guarded from making major mistakes, miserable failures. However, there are some lessons in life that we only get through a good belly flop, a real failure. Paul gives us 3 steps for our decision-making process about anything. And there is nothing before you, nothing which cannot be approached with this process. Number 1, don't worry. Now, it sounds a lot simpler than it really is, but how do you avoid worry? Worry is best handled by considering the pros and cons of the result of the decision. Worry means I'm sitting there and I don't know, I don't have anything solid. It's this, it's that, it's the other. But when you begin to concentrate, for me it's writing it down. Pros, cons. What's good about this? What's bad about this? What can the outcome be? You weigh everything that you can think of on both sides, the good and the bad. Then you pray and ask the Lord to guide you. Second step, pray about it. You've done the pros and cons. God, this is what it looks like to me. I think it's a good decision. I don't know. Will you guide me in this? And after you've prayed, you trust the peace. Because after you pray, you decide. You make a decision. Are our decisions irrevocable? Only the one where you consider jumping off the cliff without a parachute. Once the decision is made and is firm in your mind, you will know if it is the correct one by the peace that follows. I've tested this too many times to say that it's only probable. I know this as a matter of course. If there is no peace about it, then change your decision. It's simple. Discovering God's will for any aspect of any decision in your life, from the ordinary, the mundane and daily, to the life-altering choices that come before us, is not at all difficult. Scary? Sometimes, but it's not difficult to make that decision. Let me give you one last illustration from my life. I stood and watched a young girl have a complete nervous breakdown right in front of me. I could have reached out and grabbed her shoulders. She had that breakdown because she could not tell whether God wanted her to use the blue mop or the yellow mop. Now, we are able to see how ridiculous that is, but at that time, in that place, it was important to her to know. She was so intent on wanting to know the will of God. If I had known then what I know now, I might have been able to help her avoid that nervous breakdown. We had to send her for help. It was that serious. Trying to learn what it takes to please the Lord should never become a burden that's too hard to bear, like that was. God only desires the best for each of us, and it is available for us to experience His best without such effort. As the verse says, His peace is beyond our understanding. So also is His love and mercy far beyond our understanding, and we should always rest in that. It takes time for many of us to learn to truly trust the Lord with our life, but we are given plenty of opportunities to trust in a lot of situations. Trust a member of the family when they're not going the way you think they should be going, and see what works out from that. All kinds of situations. Do not drive yourself to distraction with decisions about your life, but simply trust the Lord and the process when faced with something which appears to be major. The Lord is very much interested in your life. At whatever stage you are today, He's interested. So let go of control. Let go of the need to make everything fit into your mold as you see it should be, and trust Him with your life. You can do it. If you've never done it before, you can learn to do it.